The first time my daughter-in-law called me dangerous, I was pouring milk into my grandson's cereal and the word slipped out of her mouth like she had been waiting to use it. She said, "You shouldn't be left alone with him, it's dangerous." And my hand froze over the bowl because in 62 years no one had ever put that word next to my name. Not my parents, not my teachers, not my husband, not even my enemies. And here was this young woman with her perfect nails and her fixed smile deciding in a single sentence that I was a threat, and my grandson looked up at me with wide eyes, confused, and asked, "Grandma, why is it dangerous?" And she laughed too loudly and said, "Oh honey, I'm just kidding," but her eyes never left mine and I knew it wasn't a joke. It was the first bullet in a war she had already declared. That evening I told my son what she had said and he rubbed his forehead and muttered, "You know how she exaggerates," but he didn't deny it, he didn't even look me in the eye. And that was when I felt the ground tilt under my feet because a son who doesn't defend his mother is a son already slipping away. A few days later I found the stove burner left on, flame low but steady, and when I turned it off she came into the kitchen and gasped, "Mom, you forgot again, this is what I mean." And I said, "I didn't cook today, you did." And she said, "Don't twist things. You're scaring us." And my son came running in because she had texted him, and he looked at the stove, then at me, then at her, and in that triangle of glances I saw where his trust was leaning. That night I wrote the date and time in a small notebook I kept in my nightstand, blue cover, lined pages, and on the first line I wrote, "She calls me dangerous." On the second line I wrote, "Stove incident." It felt strange, documenting my own life like a criminal keeping alibis, but I knew I would need proof because the game she was playing wasn't about words, it was about erasing me one incident at a time. Soon the whispers started with the neighbors. Mrs. Clark across the street told me gently, "I hear you've been forgetful lately," and I asked, "Who told you that?" And she wouldn't answer, just pressed her lips tight the way people do when they don't want to get dragged into someone else's storm. And I knew the source. I knew exactly whose tongue had carried that poison. One morning I found scissors on the floor of the nursery, sharp blades open, and when I picked them up she appeared in the doorway with that same smile and said, "You really should be more careful. What if he had stepped on them?" And I said, "Why would I leave scissors in a nursery?" And she said, "I don't know. Maybe you forgot." And my grandson said, "Grandma doesn't forget." And she shot him a look so cold he shrank into silence. And I kissed his head and whispered, "You're right, darling." Because I would not let her rewrite me in front of him. Later that week she told my son she caught me leaving the back door unlocked, and I heard them arguing in the living room, her voice sharp, his voice tired, and when I stepped in he said, "Mom, please, just try harder, okay?" And I wanted to scream that the only thing I was guilty of was trusting the wrong woman, but instead I nodded, then went to my room and wrote it all down. Back door unlocked accusation, no proof. By the time the month ended there was a pattern, knives left on counters I hadn't touched, gas burners left low, lights turned on in rooms I hadn't entered, each followed by her gentle voice telling my son, "Your mother is slipping, she needs help." And each time his shoulders sagged a little more as if the weight of her lies was heavier than the truth of my decades of care. I thought of confronting her, but every time I saw that smile stretched thin across her teeth I knew she wanted me to explode. She wanted me to look hysterical, because then she could say, "See, dangerous, unstable, I told you so." So I held my tongue and sharpened my pen instead, every incident logged, every witness noted, because I felt in my bones that this wasn't about small slights or domestic quarrels, it was about power, about the walls of this house and the garden outside and the deeds with my name on them. And she wasn't content to marry my son, she wanted to bury me beneath paperwork until I no longer existed except as a cautionary tale. And that night as I closed the blue notebook I whispered into the dark, "If you want a war, you've chosen the wrong old woman." And the house creaked back like it understood, like it was swearing loyalty to me and not to the intruder who thought she could take my place. It did not take long before she escalated, because whispers and little accidents were not enough for her. She wanted a scene, a public humiliation. So one Sunday afternoon when the family came for dinner, she announced loudly at the table, "I think it's time we talked about Mom's safety." And I nearly dropped the serving spoon into the potatoes because the word safety tasted like poison coming from her mouth. And my brother, who had come with his wife, looked at me sharply, confused, and she continued, "The other day she left the stove on again, and I just worry about the baby." And I said, "That never happened," but my son laid his hand over hers and nodded solemnly like a man already convinced, and my brother's wife shifted uncomfortably, trying to change the subject, but my daughter-in-law pressed on, "It's not just the stove, there have been scissors in the nursery, doors left unlocked. It's only a matter of time before something terrible happens." And my grandson piped up, brave as ever, "Grandma doesn't forget things," and she shot him a look so sharp it made him shrink back into silence, and I realized she was willing to wound even her own child's trust if it meant securing her version of the story. After everyone left, I sat at the kitchen table with my blue notebook open and wrote every detail down: who was present, what was said, who looked uncomfortable, who stayed quiet, because I knew the battle was moving from whispers to testimonies, and one day those looks across the table would matter more than casseroles and small talk. The next morning I found a letter in the mailbox from the county's family services, requesting a wellness visit based on anonymous concerns, and the words might as well have been signed with her perfect manicure, because who else would have called them? And I prepared. I cleaned the house spotless, laid out bills paid on time, grocery lists with dates, calendars with doctor appointments, and when the worker arrived she walked through the rooms with a clipboard and asked gentle but probing questions, and I answered every one calmly, and when she left she gave me a polite smile but wrote something down before closing her folder, and I leaned over just far enough to glimpse the words "possible confusion," and I almost laughed. Because confusion is what liars sow when they run out of proof. That evening my son came into my room, awkward, and said, "Mom, maybe it's time you considered some help around the house." And I asked, "Help or surveillance?" And he sighed and said, "You're twisting things." And I said, "No, she is twisting you." And he snapped, "Don't make this harder," and stormed out before I could answer. I felt my heart ache but not break, because I knew love can bend under pressure, but truth is steel, and steel doesn't bend, it waits. A few nights later I woke to the smell of gas, faint but real, and I rushed to the kitchen and found the burner turned just enough to leak without a flame, and she was standing in the doorway in her robe, feigning surprise, and said, "Oh no, did you forget again?" And I said, "No, but I'll remember this." And I took a photo of the dial with my phone, time-stamped, then wrote it in my notebook under the heading, "Gas leak, deliberate, witness present." I began to hide copies of my notes in different places, under the floorboard, in the attic, in the neighbor's shed, because I knew that if she ever found the book she would burn it, and without evidence I was just an old woman with complaints, but with evidence I was a wall she could not push over. My daughter came by that weekend and I told her what had been happening, and she frowned and said, "She's always been sharp with her words, but are you sure you're not reading too much into it?" And I opened the blue notebook and showed her the timeline, the dates, the letters, the photo of the gas dial, and her face went pale as she whispered, "This is too much to be coincidence." And I said, "Exactly, accidents don't repeat themselves with such neat timing," and she promised to stand by me if things got worse. I knew then I wasn't completely alone, that even if my son was lost in his wife's shadow, I still had one child who saw me, and that small flicker of loyalty was enough to keep my spine straight. That night I stood in the hallway, looking at the photos on the wall, my son's kindergarten smile, my daughter's graduation gown, the family trips and Christmas mornings, And I told myself that the woman who built these memories was not going to be erased by a newcomer with sharp teeth hidden behind polite laughter. And as the house settled into silence, I whispered to the walls, "Remember me, because I will need you to testify when they try to call me a ghost." The wellness visit must not have given her the result she wanted, because the very next week she changed tactics. She started inviting neighbors over under the guise of playdates for my grandson, and then letting little comments slip while pouring coffee. "It's been so stressful, watching over Mom. She forgets so much these days." And I would hear the word forget float across my own kitchen like smoke, choking me while I scrubbed the counters spotless. And I watched the neighbors nod politely, their eyes flicking toward me with pity, the kind of pity that stings worse than anger. I began to notice things moved in my house: the teapot in the wrong cupboard, the mail tucked under a pile instead of in its usual tray, and when I confronted her she smiled and said, "Oh, maybe you misplaced it." And my son sighed heavily as if exasperated by a child, not his mother, and I felt the sharp twist of betrayal lodge itself deeper, but I wrote it all down, every detail, every item out of place, because I knew that a pattern drawn in ink cannot be denied. One night while I was folding laundry, I heard whispers in the next room, my son's voice low, hers sharper. "She's getting worse. We need to act before something happens." And my son muttered, "I don't want to hurt her." And she hissed back, "It's for the best, for all of us." And then I heard silence, the kind that means a decision has been made, and I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. But instead of breaking, I felt steel rise in my chest, because now I knew they were plotting openly, and that meant they would leave trails. Sure enough, a week later, a man in a suit knocked at my door with a clipboard, introducing himself as from a legal office, asking if I had considered future planning. And when I asked who sent him, he said, "Your family reached out," and I smiled politely, invited him in, poured him tea, and then asked him to repeat everything while I recorded on my phone under the table, his words clear, "They're concerned about your competency." And when he left, I sat at the table replaying the recording until my ears ached, because now I had proof not just of whispers, but of intent. That weekend my daughter visited again, and I played her the recording, showed her the notebook, the photo of the gas dial, the letters, and she put her hand over mine and said, "Mom, this is serious. They could actually take this to court." And I said, "Let them. The truth is heavier than their lies." And she shook her head with tears in her eyes, "But lies spread faster." And I answered, "Not when every step is documented." Meanwhile, my grandson grew quieter around me, no longer running into my arms with the same joy. And when I asked him why, he whispered, "Mommy says you get confused, that you might hurt yourself." And my heart broke in a way it hadn't before, not from betrayal of a man or a son, but from the thought of losing the pure trust of a child who had always seen me as safety, not danger. I hugged him tight and whispered, "Don't believe everything you hear, believe what you see." And he nodded, small but uncertain, and I knew she was winning pieces of him one by one. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I made a decision. I would no longer just collect evidence. I would begin preparing for war in daylight, which meant contacting someone beyond my walls, someone who understood how paper could both destroy and save a life. And I thought of my old friend Margaret, who had worked as a paralegal for decades, and I called her the next morning, my voice shaking but steady enough, and I said, "It's happening, just like the stories we used to hear in court files, but it's me this time." And she said, "Bring me everything, I'll help you sort it." And I felt a small wave of relief crash through me, because now I was not just a target, I was a fighter with allies. When I hung up the phone, I opened the notebook and wrote in bold letters across the page, "They believe I am weak, but tomorrow I will show them that weakness can write affidavits too." I should have known she wouldn't stop at whispers and papers, because when someone decides you're an obstacle, they don't rest until you are moved out of the way. And the way she chose was through the one person she knew could break me, my grandson. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sun sharp through the windows, and I was in the kitchen making him a sandwich when suddenly he cried out from the living room, a thin cry not of pain but of fright, and when I rushed in I found him sitting on the floor beside an open bottle of pills scattered across the carpet. My blood went cold, and behind him she stood with her hand on her chest gasping, "Oh my God, Mom, how could you leave these where he plays?" And I said, "Those are not mine, I keep all my medicine in a locked box." And she shook her head, eyes wide for effect. "I found them in your drawer." And my grandson looked at me with confusion, torn between trust and fear, and I knew she had planted them. The bottle was labeled with my name, but the cap was too loose, like it had been twisted open in advance, and when my son came home minutes later she rushed to him in tears, sobbing, "She nearly poisoned him, we can't ignore this anymore," and he held her, glaring at me like I was a stranger in my own house. I tried to explain. I told him to check the lockbox where my real prescriptions were still sealed, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept repeating, "What if he had swallowed one? What if?" as though the what if was already enough to condemn me. That night I could hear them whispering in their room, her voice breaking into practiced sobs, his voice low and angry, and I knew what she was telling him, that I was unsafe, that I was dangerous, that the word I had written in my notebook weeks ago was now being carved into his heart. The next day I called Margaret, my paralegal friend, and told her everything, every detail of the pill incident, and she said, "You need photos, you need timestamps, you need to show a pattern." And I said, "I already have a pattern, I've been writing it down." And she told me to hide the notebook somewhere even safer, so I slipped it into the lining of my old winter coat hanging in the back closet, because I knew she would never look there. A few days later a letter arrived from Child Protective Services, notifying me of an investigation based on a safety incident, and I sat at the table with trembling hands reading words that accused me of negligence, words that could take away not just my grandson's trust but his presence in my life. When the investigator came I was ready. I had laid out my lockbox with intact prescriptions, receipts from the pharmacy, even a video my daughter had helped me make showing the box locked and sealed, and I explained calmly that the bottle must have been planted, that I had never left medicine out, and though the investigator nodded and took notes, I saw her eyes flick toward the living room where my daughter-in-law sat pretending to soothe my grandson, whispering to him, "It's okay, Mommy's here," and I wanted to scream that it was not okay, that he was being taught to fear the only woman who had ever baked him cookies at midnight, but I kept my composure because I knew rage would only feed her story. That night I wrote everything into the notebook, every word the investigator said, every glance exchanged, every lie my daughter-in-law performed, and at the bottom of the page I wrote, "She is building a case, but so am I." My daughter came the next day, and when I told her what had happened she clenched her fists and said, "This is beyond petty, this is criminal," and she promised to testify for me if it came to that, and for the first time in weeks I felt a thread of hope. But the war was only deepening, because a few nights later I heard my grandson crying in his room, and when I went to comfort him my daughter-in-law blocked the doorway and said sharply, "He needs stability, not confusion," and pushed me back into the hall, and my son stood behind her silent, his eyes darting away like a coward, and I thought, if this continues she will erase me not just from his life but from his memory, and that I could never allow. I went back to my room and opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "Tomorrow I call Navarro, the lawyer who saved me once before, because this battle is already headed where she lives, the courtroom." And as I set down the pen I swore to myself that if they wanted to label me dangerous, I would show them what dangerous truly looked like when a woman fights for her name, her home, and the child who still carries her blood. The letter came on a Thursday afternoon, plain white envelope with the county seal, and inside were words that turned my kitchen colder than January, "Petition for temporary guardianship." My name was typed at the top beneath the heading Respondent, as though I were already reduced to a defendant in my own life, and the petition was signed by my son and his wife. stating that I was no longer capable of independent decision-making and posed a danger to the minor child living in the home. I sat at the table reading the sentences over and over until the paper blurred, because it wasn't just lies anymore, it was official, stamped, and carried by the law. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from fury, because I knew every incident they listed was staged: the stove, the scissors, the pills, the unlocked door, all planted like weeds in my garden, and now they had harvested the crop of deceit. I picked up the phone and called Navarro, my lawyer, and when she heard my voice she didn't waste time with sympathy. She said, "Bring me everything, every page of that blue notebook, every photo, every receipt." And I said, "I already started a file." And she said, "Good, because they just declared war." That evening my daughter came over and I showed her the petition, and she cried angry tears. How could he do this to his own mother? And I said, "Because love bends under pressure, and he is not strong enough to hold it straight." But even as I said it, I wanted to believe there was still a chance to pull him back. My grandson sat quietly at the table coloring, glancing up at me with uncertain eyes, and I whispered, "Grandma's fine, sweetheart," and he nodded but pressed harder on the crayon until it snapped in half, and the sound broke something in me. The next day Navarro and I sat in her office surrounded by towers of files, and she laid out the strategy like a general planning a siege: medical evaluations, affidavits from neighbors like Mrs. Patel and Mrs. Clark, the police report about the gas, the recording of the paralegal contact, the video of my locked prescriptions, everything bound in order. "They want to prove incapacity," she said, "so we prove capacity louder. We don't just defend, we attack the lies." I nodded, because defense alone has never won a war, you must strike. That weekend I walked the neighborhood, speaking to those who had seen the whispers firsthand, and to my surprise most agreed to help. Even Mrs. Clark admitted, "She told me you'd been forgetting things, but I never saw it myself." And she signed a statement to that effect, and I hugged her so tightly she laughed nervously, but I saw in her eyes a flash of shame for believing even a sliver of the lies. Meanwhile my son avoided me, sending short texts about letting the lawyers handle it, and my daughter-in-law smirked when we passed in the hallway, a smirk that said she believed the system would finish what she started. But I had lived long enough to know the system only eats those who walk in unarmed, and I was walking in with an arsenal of ink. The night before the first hearing I stood in my garden, the roses wild and unruly, and I thought of how she wanted me trimmed back, pruned until I was small and quiet, and I whispered to the thorns, "They don't know yet, but I am the kind of flower that cuts when you grasp too hard." I went inside, opened the blue notebook, and on a fresh page wrote, "Tomorrow they will call me unfit. Tomorrow I will show them what unfit looks like on their faces when the truth is read aloud." And as I closed the book I felt the house steady itself around me like it, too, was preparing for court. The courthouse smelled like dust and old air conditioning, and as I walked through the metal detector with my daughter at my side I felt the weight of every eye on me, some curious, some pitying, some hungry for spectacle. Because nothing excites people more than the sight of a family tearing itself apart. My son and his wife were already there, sitting with their lawyer, she in a crisp navy dress like she thought she was auditioning for sainthood, him in a wrinkled suit that made him look more like a boy caught cheating on a test than a man accusing his mother of madness. When the clerk called the case, the words echoed too loudly, "Petition for temporary guardianship of my name." I sat straighter, because I wanted the room to see that the woman they were about to paint as frail and dangerous walked in on her own 2 feet, carrying her own files, with her eyes sharp and her memory sharper. Their lawyer began with the same rehearsed lines I had already seen in the petition: declining memory, unsafe incidents, risk to the minor child. Each word was a pebble tossed into a pond, and he waited for ripples of sympathy. But the judge only scribbled notes. Then he called my daughter-in-law to the stand, and she walked with careful steps, shoulders back, lips pursed in that way that pretends sorrow while concealing triumph. She spoke sweetly at first, describing me as loving, but increasingly confused, citing the scissors, the stove, the pills, each lie polished until it shone like glass. She even clutched a tissue, dabbing at eyes that stayed dry. When she said, "I just worry she could harm our child without realizing," my stomach twisted, because those words were daggers sharpened to pierce a judge's heart. My son was called next, and his testimony was softer, reluctant. "I don't want to be here, but I think she needs help," and I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the flicker of doubt, but it was buried under her grip on his knee, her silent reminder of whose script he was reading. When it was my turn, Navarro rose and called me to the stand, and the lawyer for my son objected, muttering about capacity, but the judge allowed it. I swore the oath and sat, my hands steady, my voice clear. Navarro began by asking simple questions: my birth date, the day of the week, the judge's name, all of which I answered without pause. Then she asked me to describe the incidents one by one, and I pulled from my folder photos of the gas dial, the recording of the future planning salesman, the receipts for locked prescriptions, the statements signed by neighbors, and finally I placed the blue notebook itself on the table, pages filled with dates and details in my handwriting. "This is my memory," I told the judge, recorded with more accuracy than any rumor. I saw a flicker in his eyes, a spark of respect. Navarro then cross-examined my daughter-in-law, asking why no fingerprints were ever taken from the pill bottle, why she hadn't called emergency services if she truly feared poisoning, why she alone seemed to witness every dangerous incident. My daughter-in-law faltered, her answers rehearsed but cracking at the edges, and the judge leaned forward, watching her carefully. At the end of the day, the judge did not rule yet. He scheduled another hearing, ordered an independent medical evaluation of me, and instructed that until then no changes could be made to the household. It was not victory, but it was not defeat. It was the middle ground of war. As we left the courtroom, my daughter-in-law hissed in my ear, "You won't win, old woman. The child will never be yours." And I looked her straight in the eye and said, "He is mine by blood and love, and you will never erase that," and for the first time her smile slipped. That night I wrote in the notebook, "She took the stand and lied. I took the stand and lived." The war continues. The independent evaluation was scheduled for the following week, and when the letter arrived I could almost hear my daughter-in-law's laughter through the envelope, because she believed doctors would see only what she had been whispering for months, that I was frail, confused, a danger even to myself. But I prepared as if it were another day in court, gathering my calendars, my bills marked paid, my grocery lists with each item checked, the blue notebook heavy with dates and details, because I knew memory is not just what you say, it is what you prove. The day of the exam, my daughter drove me to the clinic, and I walked in with my head high. The doctor, a woman with sharp eyes behind her glasses, asked me questions that seemed too easy: the date, the season, the name of the president. Then she asked me to spell a word backwards, and I did without pause, then to count backwards by sevens, and I laughed. I raised children. I can do math faster than lies travel, and she smiled. She asked about my daily life, and I explained in detail how I cook, clean, tend the garden, manage the bills. Then I placed the notebook on the table and said, "And here is the record of everything they have staged against me," and she leafed through the pages slowly, her brow furrowing deeper as she read the entries about scissors, pills, gas, forged whispers. At the end she looked at me and said, "You are not confused. You are under attack." Her report was printed on official letterhead with her license number, and the words glowed on the page: "No evidence of cognitive impairment. Patient demonstrates strong judgment and memory." I held that paper like a sword. But of course she did not give up. 2 days later, while I was watching my grandson play in the yard, I heard her voice rise in panic from the kitchen, screaming my name. I rushed in to find water flooding across the floor, the dishwasher door open, a puddle spreading fast. She shouted, "Look what you've done. You left the cycle running without soap. You flooded the kitchen," and I stared at her because I hadn't touched the dishwasher all week. My grandson looked between us, frightened, and she grabbed her phone, snapping photos of the water, muttering, "Evidence, finally evidence." But she had been careless this time. When she turned away, I glanced at the machine and saw the settings dial twisted to drain/cancel, not normal Washington. It had been forced open mid-cycle, a trick anyone could do. I pulled out my phone and photographed it myself, the knob, the waterline, the timestamp. Then I calmly turned to her and said, "You planted this flood, and I will prove it," and for the first time she looked rattled, because she had not expected me to meet her theater with my own documentation. That night my son confronted me, holding her phone like a holy relic, and said, "Mom, why would you sabotage the kitchen?" And I handed him my phone with the photos, the timestamp, the dial position, and I said, "Because liars don't know how machines work, but truth does," and his mouth opened and shut like a fish gasping, but he said nothing, because silence is easier than admitting he has married a serpent. I wrote it all down in the notebook: dishwasher incident, staged, proof collected. When I laid the pen down, my hand steady, I realized something important. She had grown reckless, desperate, because the doctor's report had closed one door, and now she was kicking at others, but each time she left fingerprints, mistakes, evidence. And I whispered to myself, the harder she pushes, the louder she proves me right. The next hearing was scheduled in 2 weeks, and Navarro said, "We will go in with the doctor's report, the neighbor statements, and now the dishwasher photos. We will not only defend, we will accuse." I nodded, because defense was survival, but accusation was justice. That night I prayed not for peace, but for strength, and as I looked at the faces in the framed photos on my wall, my children smiling from decades past, I thought, "You may not recognize me now, but when this is over you will see who I have always been, not weak, not dangerous, but the woman who remembers everything." The second hearing drew a bigger crowd than the first, as though people could smell the blood of scandal and wanted seats at the feast. I walked in with Navarro at my side, the doctor's report folded crisp in her briefcase, my daughter behind me carrying a folder thick with affidavits and photos. My son and his wife were already seated with their lawyer, she in a pale blouse this time, the picture of innocence, her hand gripping his arm like reins on a horse. When the judge entered the room, the air seemed to tighten, and as the clerk read the case I steadied my breath because I knew today would be the day truth began to break through the fog. The petitioner's lawyer began again with his recital of incapacity and risk, but Navarro rose smoothly and said, "Your Honor, before we continue, the independent evaluation you ordered has been completed," and she handed the report to the clerk. The judge read in silence, his eyes moving line by line, then looked up at my daughter-in-law and said, "This report finds no impairment whatsoever. In fact, it explicitly states Mrs. Vale demonstrates strong judgment and memory." A ripple moved through the room, the kind of sound people make when they see a mask slip. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "With all respect, Your Honor, evaluations can be misleading. She has good days and bad days." Navarro didn't wait, she called me to the stand. I answered the oath firmly, then described my routines, my bills, my garden, my cooking, all without pause. Then Navarro held up photos of the dishwasher incident, showing the dial forced mid-cycle, time-stamped shots of the water and my shoes dry as bone. Your Honor, she said, this is not forgetfulness. This is sabotage staged to look like forgetfulness. The judge studied the photos, then turned to my daughter-in-law. Were you the one who discovered this alleged flood? He asked. She nodded quickly. Yes, I was the one who found it, and Navarro said softly, she didn't just find it, she created it, and the room buzzed again. Next, Navarro called Mrs. Clark, my neighbor, who testified that my daughter-in-law had whispered to her about my memory issues but admitted she herself had never seen any confusion, and then Mrs. Patel, who swore she heard the hiss of the gas leak and saw me photographing it while my daughter-in-law stood silent. Piece by piece the lies began to look less like concern and more like construction. My son was called next, and Navarro asked him, "Can you name one incident you personally witnessed of your mother forgetting something dangerous?" He shifted in his seat, stammered, "Well, the pills," and Navarro cut him off with the pharmacy receipt showing the sealed box, the video of me opening it, intact. He turned red, his eyes dropping to the floor. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. So far, all we have are accidents reported only by the daughter-in-law, contradicted by physical evidence and medical evaluation. Why should this court strip a competent woman of her rights based on uncorroborated claims? Silence followed, broken only by the shuffling of papers at their table. My daughter-in-law's face tightened, and in a burst she stood, tears rolling on command, crying, "She's dangerous. You don't understand. She could kill my child." The judge banged his gavel, sharp as thunder. "Sit down. Mrs. Vale is not on trial for imagined fears. She has provided documentation, witnesses, and medical clearance. This court demands proof, not theater." For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw her falter, the mask slipping, her hand gripping my son's arm so hard he winced. The judge adjourned for the day, setting the final hearing for 2 weeks later, instructing both parties to prepare closing arguments. As we filed out, I passed close enough to hear her hiss at my son, "You promised me she'd be out," and his silence was louder than any words. Outside, reporters gathered, microphones flashing. One asked me, "Do you feel vindicated?" I looked straight at the camera and said, "I feel seen." That is the beginning of justice. And the words felt heavier than stone but lighter than the lies that had weighed me down for months. That night at home I opened the blue notebook and on a fresh page I wrote, "Doctor's report cleared me." Judge saw the mask. She is slipping. The end is not yet, but it is closer. And I whispered to myself, they thought I was old and weak, but what they never counted on was that I can remember every single lie. I knew the cracks were widening because desperation has a smell, sharp and sour, and she carried it with her every time she walked into a room. The polite smile was gone now, replaced by a tightness around her mouth, a twitch in her jaw when she thought no one was watching. A few days after the hearing, she came into the kitchen while I was peeling apples for a pie and said flatly, "You won't survive the next round, you know that, right?" Her voice was low, a hiss, not the sugar she usually poured in front of my son. I looked at her calmly and said, "The only thing I won't survive is your lies if I stop writing them down," and I tapped the blue notebook on the counter, and for a flicker of a second her eyes darted toward it like a thief spotting gold. The next morning my grandson refused to come into the kitchen for breakfast. When I asked why, he whispered, "Mommy says you might hurt me if I'm alone with you," and my heart shattered so violently I had to grip the chair to stay upright. I bent down, looked him in the eye, and said, "Sweetheart, has Grandma ever hurt you?" And he shook his head quickly, "No," but his little lips trembled, because children believe what they hear even when it fights what they know. Later I heard her telling my son in the hallway, "He's scared, you can see it, he won't even eat her food anymore," and I realized she was poisoning not just his trust but his very memories, rewriting our moments into shadows. That night I hid the notebook under the loose tile in the laundry room floor, because I could feel her searching, her eyes always roaming the house when she thought I wasn't looking. And sure enough, the following afternoon while I napped lightly in the chair, I heard a faint rustle in my bedroom. I rose silently, walked down the hall, and there she was, rifling through my dresser drawers with gloved hands. When she noticed me, her face went pale, then quickly rearranged into outrage. "I was looking for my son's sweater," she snapped, holding nothing but air. I laughed, cold and sharp, and said, "Try the closet you actually use," and she stormed past me muttering, "Crazy old woman," but her slip was obvious. She was hunting evidence, because liars know the only thing stronger than their stories is proof. 2 days later an anonymous call brought Child Protective Services again, and this time the claim was that my grandson had come home with a bruise on his arm from his grandmother. When the investigator arrived, I demanded to know who made the report, but of course it was confidential. My daughter happened to be visiting, and she spoke firmly. "That bruise came from soccer practice. I saw him fall." The investigator looked unconvinced until I produced the team's schedule and a note from the coach. I saw the weariness in her eyes, the way bureaucrats look when they realize they're being used in a domestic war. She left with her clipboard, but not before I caught her glance at my daughter-in-law, who stood in the corner twisting her hands in mock worry. By then Navarro had advised me to install cameras in the common rooms, legally, and to keep every recording backed up in the cloud. "She will push harder," Navarro warned, "and when she does, we'll have the receipts on video." So I did, small cameras in the kitchen, the living room, the hallway. And within a week they caught her. One afternoon she poured milk into a glass, looked around, then deliberately spilled it onto the floor near the stove, placing the jug back on the counter as though I had left it. Moments later she called my son in, shrieking, "Look at what your mother's done again," but the camera saw it all, her hand tipping the glass, her eyes darting. I sent the clip to Navarro that night, and she called me with a voice full of steel. "This is the crack we needed. Her credibility is about to collapse." Still, the worst cut was my son. He came to me late one evening, standing in the doorway of my room like a stranger, and said, "Mom, can't you just make this easier? Sign the papers, let us handle things. You don't need all this stress." And I answered quietly, "The only stress in this house is the woman who whispers in your ear at night. If I sign, I'm signing my life away, and you'll wake up one day realizing you killed your own mother with ink." He flinched, but said nothing, retreating back into the shadows where her voice lives. That night, in the silence of the house, I opened the notebook and wrote, "She is slipping, reckless, caught on camera. But he is still blind. The final battle is not her lies, it is breaking his silence." And I whispered into the still air, "The day is coming when the truth will be too heavy for him to carry, and he will have to drop her hand or be crushed with her." By the time we returned to court, the air in the hallway hummed like it was charged with electricity, because Navarro had filed the motion to introduce the video footage, and everyone knew it would either break their case or mine. I sat straight on the bench, my daughter on one side, my hands folded over the blue notebook on my lap like a holy book. Across the aisle my son looked pale, his tie crooked, while my daughter-in-law sat rigid, her lips tight, her eyes darting to the exit as though she could slip away before the storm hit. When the clerk called the case, the room fell silent, and Navarro stood, calm and sharp, announcing, "Your Honor, we have obtained video evidence of deliberate staging by the petitioner's wife." The judge raised an eyebrow and motioned her to proceed. The screen flickered to life. First came the clip of the kitchen, my daughter-in-law pouring milk into a glass, glancing over her shoulder, then deliberately tipping it onto the floor near the stove before placing the jug neatly on the counter. Seconds later, she was calling my son in. Her voice feigned panic. "Look what your mother's done again." The courtroom gasped, a sound like wind ripping through trees, and my son's face drained of color as he watched his wife perform her lie on repeat, caught in pixels and timestamps. Navarro let the silence stretch, then played the second clip, her rifling through drawers in my bedroom while I napped, lifting papers, tossing them back, searching like a thief. The judge leaned forward, his voice cold. "Mrs. Vale's daughter-in-law, do you deny this is you?" She stammered, tried to say the footage was taken out of context, but her words stumbled over themselves like drunks. Navarro pressed, "Out of context?" Out of context to pour milk on the floor and frame an old woman for negligence? The gavel cracked once, silencing the murmurs. The judge turned to my son. "Did you know your wife staged these incidents?" His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came, only the sound of a man realizing the ground beneath him had been hollow all along. Then came the doctor's report, read into the record again for emphasis. No evidence of cognitive impairment. Patient demonstrates strong judgment and memory. Navarro layered it with neighbor affidavits, the pharmacy receipts, the police report about the gas leak. Piece by piece, the walls she had built to paint me as confused crumbled until nothing stood but her own shadow. When it was her turn to speak, she abandoned her sweet tone and spat venom. "She's lying. She's manipulating you all. She writes everything down in that stupid notebook, making herself look perfect. She's dangerous, you just don't see it." Her voice cracked into a scream, echoing off the wood panels, and the judge slammed his gavel again. "Enough. Sit down or I will hold you in contempt." The mask was gone. She shook, red-faced, gripping the table so hard her knuckles blanched. My son tried to calm her, whispering, "Please, stop," but she pulled her arm away, hissing, "Don't you dare leave me now." And I watched him, watched the conflict storm across his face, the weight of lies against the proof he had just seen, the years of loyalty against the truth in black and white. For the first time his eyes lifted to mine and did not look away. The judge concluded the day with a heavy voice. "This court does not look kindly on attempts to manipulate proceedings with staged incidents and false testimony. At the final hearing, we will address not only the petition but possible sanctions for abuse of process." My daughter-in-law slumped in her seat, muttering under her breath, and when the bailiff called recess she bolted for the restroom like a hunted animal. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed again, their questions sharp. "Did you expect to catch her on video? Do you think your son knew?" I said only one thing, steady and clear: lies rot in the dark. I simply turned on the light. And the flash of cameras felt like a kind of justice, the world finally seeing what I had been screaming into silence for months. That night I wrote in the blue notebook, "Video shown, mask torn, judge furious, son wavering. Victory is not here yet, but it is walking toward me." And I whispered into the quiet house, "She wanted to prove I was dangerous. Now everyone has seen the only danger in this home, and it isn't me." The final hearing came sooner than I expected, though by then days had begun to blur together like pages turned too quickly, all ink and no rest. The courtroom was packed, not just with neighbors and curious faces, but with reporters, even strangers who had followed the story since Navarro filed the motion for sanctions. I felt the weight of every gaze on me as I walked to the front, steady, my blue notebook pressed to my chest like armor. Across the aisle my son looked haggard, sleepless, while his wife sat stiff as a statue, her jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might crack. The judge opened with a voice that carried no warmth. "This court has heard testimony, reviewed evidence, and witnessed behavior that casts grave doubt on the credibility of the petitioners. Navarro rose immediately, stacking the evidence in order: the forged narratives, the staged milk spill, the ransacked drawers, the gas leak, the medical report, the affidavits from neighbors, the receipts, the video recordings. Each piece was placed in front of the judge like bricks in a wall, and with every brick my daughter-in-law's face grew paler. Then it was her turn. She stood shakily, clinging to the table, and launched into a rant that abandoned all pretense of dignity. She is dangerous. She's manipulating all of you. She controls the story. She writes everything down to make herself look sane. You can't trust her, she'll ruin us all. Her voice cracked into shrillness, echoing through the chamber, and the judge raised a hand, but she didn't stop. She's old, she's weak, she's lying, and you're all too blind to see it. My son tugged her sleeve, whispering, "Enough," but she jerked away, eyes blazing, and screamed, "If she stays, we lose everything." The gavel thundered, silencing her at last. The judge turned to my son, his voice cold. "Do you stand by this petition, or do you wish to withdraw your name?" The silence stretched until I thought it might choke him, but finally he spoke, voice breaking. I was wrong. I didn't know. I thought we were protecting her, but it was all lies." His words trembled, but they were words nonetheless, and my daughter-in-law's head whipped toward him like a snake striking, her mouth open in shock. "How dare you?" she hissed, but he didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the table. The judge leaned forward. "Very well. This court dismisses the petition with prejudice. Furthermore, sanctions will be imposed on the petitioners for abuse of process. This matter will be referred to the district attorney for review of possible perjury and fraud." The gavel came down with a crack that rang in my bones like freedom itself. Gasps filled the courtroom. My daughter-in-law collapsed back into her chair, muttering curses under her breath, her face blotched red with fury. My son sat hollow-eyed, broken between shame and relief. Navarro placed a steady hand on my arm, whispering, "It's over. You won." But I knew it was more complicated than winning, because victory in court does not erase betrayal at the table where you once broke bread together. As we left the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their questions sharp as spears. "Do you forgive your son? What happens to your daughter-in-law now? How do you feel about your family's betrayal?" I stopped on the courthouse steps, raised my head, and said clearly, "Betrayal cuts deep, but truth cuts deeper." Today, truth was heard. Cameras flashed, and in that light I felt years of invisibility lift from me. That night I returned home, placed the blue notebook on the table, and opened to a fresh page. I wrote, "Petition dismissed, sanctions ordered, son confessed, mask shattered. I am still here. I am still whole." And I whispered into the stillness of the house. She tried to write me out of my own story, but I held the pen. When the dust settled and the gavel's echo faded from my ears, I expected silence, maybe even peace, but peace does not come quickly after war, it arrives in fragments. The first fragment was the sight of my daughter-in-law packing bags in the driveway 2 days after the hearing, her voice raised, accusing my son of betrayal, of weakness, of siding with that woman. I stood at the upstairs window, watching her fling clothes into the car, her hands shaking, her face twisted into the mask of someone who has lost control of everything. She glanced up once, caught my eyes, and for the first time I saw no smile, no performance, just naked hatred. Then she slammed the door, tires screeching as she sped away, leaving my son standing in the driveway with his shoulders hunched like a boy again. The second fragment came when my grandson ran to me, clutching my waist, whispering, "Mommy said bad things about you, but I don't believe her anymore," and his little arms around me were stronger than any verdict. I kissed his hair and told him, "Believe what you see, not what you're told," and he nodded, holding tighter, as if he understood more than any child should have to. My son came in later, his eyes red, and sat at my table where so many lies had been whispered. He tried to speak, choking on the words, and finally managed, "I'm sorry, Mom. I let her convince me. I didn't protect you." I listened, but I did not rush to comfort him, because forgiveness is not a gift handed out like candy, it is earned. I said only, "You protected her lies instead of my truth. That wound will take time." He bowed his head, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he looked like the boy who once held my hand across the street. The third fragment was the letter from Navarro, confirming that the district attorney had opened an inquiry into perjury and fraud. My daughter-in-law might face charges now, and though part of me wanted her to pay, another part only wanted her gone, her poison drained from the air we breathed. The house felt different without her, the walls lighter, the rooms brighter, the silence no longer suffocating but restful. That weekend my daughter brought flowers, bright yellow roses, and together we planted them in the garden, beside the wild ones I had always refused to prune. As we dug the soil, she said, "You're free now, Mom," and I looked at her and answered, "Freedom is never free. It costs blood, trust, and nights without sleep. But yes, I am free enough to plant again." We watered the new roses, and I thought of how every thorn is both protection and beauty, just like me. At night, I opened the blue notebook to its last page. So many entries, each one a battle fought, a wound survived, a lie unmasked. I wrote slowly, "The war is over. I am still standing. I am not erased. I am not dangerous. I am simply alive." And I closed it, placing it in the fireproof box beside my deed and the keys to the house, because my story no longer needed to be defended, it had been proven. My son comes by often now, quieter, humbler, trying to mend what was broken. Sometimes he brings my grandson, sometimes he just sits in silence with a cup of tea, as if being in my presence is the penance he owes. I do not know if our bond will ever return to what it was, but I know it is healing, and healing, even in fragments, is better than despair. As for her, the woman who tried to replace me with her lies, I do not say her name anymore. She exists only as a caution in my memory, a reminder that not all smiles mean love, not all family means loyalty, and not all women who marry your sons deserve to be called daughter. The house sighs differently now at night, no longer under siege, but at rest, like an old animal finally left in peace. And as I walk through its halls, touching the walls that kept me safe when people turned against me, I whisper to them, "We survived." And when I stand in the garden at dusk, the new roses glowing in the last light, I say aloud to no one and to everyone, to the sky, to the world, to the ghosts of betrayal that thought they could bury me. Not dead yet. Not erased. Not conquered. And never again owned.